Hello class, this is Mrs. Gallegos. Today's tutorial will be on how to name a binary ionic compound. This information can be found in Chapter 8 of your book, Section 3. What is a chemical formula? A chemical formula is a symbolic representation of the composition of a compound. And so the letters are the symbols of the elements that are in that compound. The numbers, which are written below the symbols, are called subscripts, and they tell us how many atoms of each element are in a compound. And the compounds we're going to be naming today are binary because they have two parts. As you can see in this chemical formula, there's one magnesium and two chlorine. So there's magnesium and there's chlorine, two parts. So there are two different types of compounds. They are binary ionic compounds and binary covalent compounds, and we need to know the difference between these compounds because we're going to use two different naming systems. So in order to identify an ionic compound, I'm going to see that one of the elements is a metal and the other element is a nonmetal. Or I could also see that one of the parts of this two-part compound will be a polyatomic ion. The other kind of compound is a binary covalent compound. Binary covalent compounds, instead of being made out of a metal and a nonmetal, are made out of two nonmetals. So you might be asking yourself, Mrs. Gallegos, how do I know a metal from a nonmetal? Well, this is where you're going to go to our periodic table. So if you have ever noticed the periodic table has a dividing line sort of to the right, and that dividing line is separating the metals from the nonmetals. So if you look right here on the top of the periodic table where the stair step begins, aluminum is a metal and silicon is a nonmetal. So everything to the left is a metal and everything to the right is a nonmetal. So oxygen, and we know that oxygen is not a metal, it's not shiny. I can't hold it in my hand like I can hold zinc or magnesium or calcium. So we know that ionic compounds are going to have one metal in them. So if I see a metal in a compound, I know it is ionic right away. So that's sort of an easy hint. So right now we're going to practice analyzing these binary compounds to determine if they are ionic or covalent. So CO2. If we look back at the periodic table, we can see that carbon and oxygen are both on the right-hand side of the stair step. So that means that carbon dioxide is a nonmetal and a nonmetal, so therefore it is covalent. Magnesium chloride. Magnesium is a metal and chlorine is a nonmetal. So this will be an ionic substance. NO2. Nitrogen and oxygen are both nonmetals, so this would be a covalent substance. And last but not least, aluminum and oxygen. Aluminum is a metal, and as soon as I see that metal, I know that this substance is an ionic substance. How to name ionic compounds. The first thing I'm going to do is take the compound and divide it into its two parts. The first element in the compound is always the metal. That's just the way that we write the formulas. And we're going to name it after its name in the periodic table. The second part of the compound is the nonmetal, and that's the agreed upon way of writing formulas. And we are going to take its name from the periodic table and replace the ending with another ending, IDE. So chlorine would become chloride. If the second part of my binary compound is a polyatomic ion, and we'll discuss them later, I'm going to name it after that polyatomic ion. And you're going to have to memorize the most common polyatomic ions. So let's practice. So the first compound, I'm going to divide it into its two parts because it's binary. The first one is the metal, so I'm going to just name it after its name in the periodic table, and Na is sodium. Then Cl, its name in the periodic table is chlorine, as we said previously, and I'm going to replace its ending with IDE. So this substance is sodium chloride. The next substance, MgCl2, it's binary, 1, 2. So I'm going to divide it into its two parts. The first part is the metal, and I simply give it its name from the periodic table, which Mg is magnesium. Then the second is a nonmetal. I take its name, chlorine, and I replace the ending I and E with IDE. And so its name is magnesium chloride. Divide the binary ionic compound in two. This is a metal. Calcium is a metal. Its name from the periodic table is calcium. And then oxygen is my nonmetal. And I replace the ending with IDE. And so this substance is called calcium oxide. All right, so these polyatomic ions. What the heck is Ms. Gallegos talking about when she talks about polyatomic ions? Well, these are the polyatomic ions, and you're going to get a table and you're going to have to memorize some common ones. Ammonium. And polyatomic ions are sort of unique. Ions, of course, are in ionic compounds because they're made out of ions. And ions are anything that has a charge. So this is actually, NH4 is actually two nonmetals. So a polyatomic ion is a covalently bonded substance, but it has a charge, and it can participate in an ionic bond. And so instead of having a metal and a nonmetal, I'll have a metal and a polyatomic ion. Or sometimes the reverse. I can have a polyatomic ion and a nonmetal. And so these are common polyatomic ions. We're going to be using as an example the hydroxide ion just in a few minutes and the sulfate ions. And you'll have to memorize their formula, SO4. Right now you don't have to memorize the charge, so just the formula and the name. So let's practice naming some substances, ionic substances that have polyatomic ions. So I'm going to first, like I always do, I'm going to divide my binary compound in half, and I see a metal here. So I know this is ionic, so I'm going to use the ionic system. So I'm going to name my metal after its name in the periodic table. And then because this is a polyatomic ion, I just use its name, and I look it up in my chart, and its name is hydroxide. So this substance is sodium hydroxide. So it's a metal and a polyatomic ion, sodium hydroxide. Now I do my next substance, NH4Cl. So I divide my binary. Now this is kind of hard. How do I know why don't I divide it right here? Well, because I've memorized that NH4 is a polyatomic ion, I know this is the first part. So this is part 1 and this is part 2. This is a little bit difficult. Then I look up the name of my NH4, and that is ammonium. And then, as you know, chlorine is the name of my second substance in my binary compound, and I replace its ending with IDE. So this substance will be a polyatomic ion and a nonmetal, and its name is ammonium chloride. Last one, we have Mg, which is my metal, and I'm going to put my dividing line between my two parts in my binary compound, and as I see, the second part is a polyatomic ion. So I have a metal and a polyatomic ion. My metal's name is magnesium, and my polyatomic ion's name is sulfate. So class, that's how we name first of all, how we figure out if a compound is ionic or covalent, and then this is how we name ionic substances. I hope this tutorial was helpful.